The Fables of Ealdred. Episode 9. The Matriarchs of Gathkar, by J.P. Tate. When the late autumn wind blew hard from the east, rolling over the Canyon Pluhurit, the canyons of dust, in the impoverished dry plains of Terlitz, it raised a column of ash a mile high, which then spread itself westward to cloud the borderlands of Piccoli and Gathkar with a pestilential wind called the Riep Lecurin, or the Flayer of Skin. Those who knew the region avoided taking to the road at this time of year unless their business was pressing. Strangers had to take it as they found it. Two riders had, to their considerable relief, passed out of the Riep Lecurin that morning, and were now progressing south in greater comfort, their animals walking steadily over the rocky ground in the dry heat. They had seen nothing but dust the day before, and the return of the sun in a clear blue sky lifted their resilient spirits. They were both individuals who recovered quickly from life's many setbacks. The first rider was mounted upon a huge ghost-grey blue roan stallion, of fearsome aspect but stately poise. There was a 7-foot ash spear and a 4-foot javelin hung in sheaths from its saddle. The buckler, a small round hand-held shield that was strung over the pommel of the saddle, was of a distinctly Anglian design that no one in this part of the world would have recognized. Equally alien was the way the horseman wore his long hair and beard plaited in braids. Like a tangle of ship's rope, it fell in a curtain to his shoulders, the beard reaching his chest, the hair showing distinct streaks of grey, for he was a man over 40 years of age. Despite this, the veteran had a lithe fluidity to his movements that might more often be found in men 20 years his junior. His weapons and bearing declared him a mercenary soldier, but he was evidently unemployed at present. He wore a close-fitting doublet with narrow breeches that tied below the knee, both stitched strong and secure in a durable black leather. At least they would have proved so on another man, but closer inspection would have disclosed that the stitching was starting to split on the shoulder and arms of the doublet, because it wasn't quite roomy enough to accommodate the muscularity of the soldier's upper body. His bucket-top riding boots still showed new, having been bought, like the rest of his clothing, only recently in the town of Pistoia in the north of Piccoli. He was Ealdred of the Paega, a clan of the Anglians, who were of the people of the Engel. The land of his birth was all of 2,000 miles away in the distant west, and he was on his way south in the hope of reaching a port on the coast of Gathkar and boarding ship to take him homeward once more. Slightly behind him and to the left, for he was her effendi and he was right-handed, rode an Oriental girl with jet-black hair cut in a bob to the neck. Her dark eyes were stoical, yet spoke of an energetically defended sense of her own dignity. Her bright green Terlitz smock, green being considered a lucky colour amongst those who hailed from the faraway steppes, was tucked into a constrictive leather girdle from which hung her falcon-headed, serrated dagger, in a cheap but skilfully engraved wooden scabbard. The smock was a fairly capacious linen shirt, with a lattice-work of laces down the front to open the garment sufficiently to display a healthy quantity of firm young cleavage in respect for her master's pleasure. The baggy linen garment normally covered her down to the thigh, as she wore the shirt without breeches, but sitting atop her black gelding she was unself-consciously revealing the full length of her athletic legs, from the hip to the ewe-leather boots that she wore Menggis style, without any strapping to tie them around the calves, so that the soft leather sagged down around her ankles in slack folds. She was Ig of the Karjan, of the community of Elijah, who were one of the Menggis nations dwelling upon the great steppes. She was all of 3,000 miles from the land of her birth, but in the opposite direction to that of her effendi. Unlike him, she had no means by which to return home, for though she was a furious and tenacious fighter in her own right, and had demonstrated her readiness to kill at the drop of a badly chosen word, she knew perfectly well that if she were to attempt to journey east alone through the vast open terrain of the Murghal and the Chevnik and the Uzbeki, she would most certainly find herself raped and enslaved before she had traversed the first 100 leagues. So she had thrown in her lot with her Effendi, a stateless and displaced woman at 19, untimely ripped from the soil of Menggis and forever shorn of her roots. Though not reconciled to this, she was young enough and had the necessary toughness of mind to cope with a set of circumstances from which she could not extricate herself. He had been a wandering mercenary for hire for longer than she had been alive, and had seen as much of the world as any man without wings. Yet it was his practice always to return to Anglia when he felt himself straying too far from the hearth of his boyhood, for his ethnicity was strong within him, and the novelty of exotic places paled after a time. So it was that he was making his way to the sea and a ship for the Engel Peninsula, or as near to it as he could contrive. That the Menggis girl was content, lacking options, to journey at his side, even though it took her west when her kindred lay in the east, was perhaps explained in the word she had chosen by which to address him, Effendi, whose meaning might be translated as either master or husband, or both. Now the two saddle-weary riders were on the border of the Gathkar queendoms, possibly the strangest place on earth, surely the most imprudent. It was a place where migratory and itinerant folk like themselves were often to be found, because the government of Gathkar believed in open borders, and made no effort to control or regulate who entered their sovereign territory. Consequently, the queendoms were overrun with the worst criminal riffraff and unruly scum of all their neighbouring kingdoms. However, the dubious character of civil life under the Gathkar Matriarchy led their neighbours to take stronger than usual measures to ensure that the borders were not open in both directions. All might pass into Gathkar, but it was very much more difficult to move from Gathkar into any of the countries that surrounded it. Passage would not be so difficult for Ealdred and Ig, because the braided white Westerner and the slant-eyed Oriental were so obviously not of Gathkari nationality that they might safely be assumed not to be afflicted with the eccentric malady of self-negation that made the ailing queendoms so freakishly unnatural to the rest of the world. For who could be sure that the political disease of the Gathkaris was not contagious?